And she told me that, I asked her, what shall I say? She said, you can say I investigated a crime for 27 years and then I solved it. So we're going to hear, that's what she said, right?
Right.
Although I have to just put a little story in. Julie, who works at the library, we have little signs in the library, and we've been recommending to everybody to come. So Julie's standing there telling this woman who comes, she said, she said, you really have to come to our program. She said, you're really going to love it. It's about a mass murder. and then she walks off, and I look at Julie, and she's young, but she's smart. She caught on. She said, that wasn't cool. I said, no, that's like asking somebody, don't you love Hitler? I mean, that's not what you say. And we agreed that what you would, a better way. We tell people, come if you like mystery. So if you like, I guess you all like mystery. So this is Carolyn Deloche. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you.
We're pleased that you came.
Thank you. How many are familiar with the Villisca axe murders across state? Nobody else. You had your own axe murder in Iowa in 1912 that I didn't know about, but I've been hearing a lot about it traveling across the state. They said it's very similar to my murder, or to the murder of my case. And when I went over to Villisca, I was talking to the guy that's like the local authority. And we noticed when we were talking, we would say, now my murder, and he would say, well, my murder, and it was back and forth, but you had 8 people axed to death in 1912, and most of them were children. So you have a tragic story yourself here, and there's no book about it. No, and I'm not planning on, no. I wouldn't touch that one with a 10-foot pole. I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first one is the story that was left behind at the turn of the century by, I would say, our ancestors in Georgia, my ancestors in Georgia, just the people in Georgia. This is a story they could live with, because by the turn of the century they realized they had executed an innocent man, and they tried to put this behind them. So by the time I came along, my generation, the story was completely forgotten, completely buried. And that's the second story, which is the true story. What I realized early in the research was not only did they choose to cover up, put it behind them, they changed what was left behind, what was told. In other words, when their grandchildren would ask about this case, they would tell them just enough to make it almost true, but actually they were telling a lie. The second story is the complete true story. It is a story that it was so painful, so horrifying to the people at the turn of the century. This is a story they could not live with. They couldn't sleep at night with, I'm sure. So this is a story that was buried. And I mean buried so well that it took me 27 years to find all the information. I just found the real killers last year. That's how long. The third story is how I uncovered that second story. And when you hear me tell that story, you'll understand why I am touring the country, giving free programs to libraries, talking about this case. You'll understand. It'll all come clear to you. But let's talk about the basic story. Let's start off with how I found the story. I went to a small girls' college in the middle of Georgia, near Macon, Georgia, which is right in the dead center of the state. And while there, I stumbled upon a diary that was kept during the Civil War by one of the teachers at the school. This diary, she would reference people by using initials. She'd say, TJ came by, we went to church, prayer meeting. SG came by, and we rolled 100 bandages to send north to the war. There's one episode, though, that she talks about that she uses the complete names of the participants. She said, the boys from the county are getting ready to be shipped north to the war in Virginia. They were the Confederates. They were the rebels. Y'all were the Yankees. This is what the school looked like at the time. And she said, the girls came out on the veranda. She said, Lizzie Murphy presented a flag and Mattie Howard gave a speech. Those names just jumped off the pages at me. I had to find out what happened to those 2 girls. My roommate thought I was crazy. Well, let's see, it's been over 100 years. What do you think's happened to them? That's exactly what she said, just as sarcastically. And I said, no, until I find their graves, those 2 are not dead to me. And I went looking for Lizzie Murphy first. Took me a while, but I found everything I could find out about her. I even tracked down some of her great-grandchildren, and I even found her grave. And then I went looking for Maddie Howard. Went looking for Maddie Howard. I knew 3 things about Maddie. I knew that she was the daughter of a very large landowner, Ben Howard, that she was from Howard's district, which was really basically the plantation. It just became a tax district, it was so large. And then thirdly, I knew that she had married captured Richard Woolfolk, a Confederate captain. That's all I knew. I went to Howard's district, and the trail led me to a dairy farm and an old man called Ralph Whidden. He was very elderly, and he was dying of emphysema. And I asked him, I said, "Where's the Woolfolk place?" And he said, "Well, you're on it." I said, "Well, I'm looking for Maddie Howard Woolfolk. Oh, is there a house around here? Is there some place that I can have an evidence of her existence?" And he sent me to the top of the hill. And there it was. There's the ruins. That's a pile, that's a chimney rubble pile. I found both chimney piles. I found the well. I found the ruins of Maddie Howard's house, Maddie Howard Woolfolk's house. I came down the hill, and he says, "So, you researching them axe murders?" I grew up in Georgia hearing about Lizzie Borden, axe murder in Massachusetts. Actually, the way they treated Lizzie Borden, you thought there was no axe murder in this country except Lizzie Borden. She only killed 2 people, and this was 9 years after this murder. The man said, "Well, that woman you're looking for, her husband, all their children, and her aunt were axed to death up on the hill." He said, "I've got the newspaper. It came with the land deed." We went back to his house, and he brought out this newspaper, the complete newspaper. 16 pages of the Macon Telegraph. Now, what is ironic? Now, Macon Telegraph is a very reputable paper then and now. Very reputable. One thing that caught my attention was this paper came out the day after the murders, August the 7th, 1887. I was there on the anniversary of the murders. I was there August the 6th, 1972. The whole front page, except for this column over here, talks about the murders. But it proceeds to tell you right here, and for the rest of the front page, it tells you that the oldest son did it. Why he did it, how he did it, with complete, total official detail, as if they've already had the investigation, they've already had the witnesses' testimonies, they've already had the trials. This is the day after the murders. Well, I had my story. Maddie had died a very tragic death, but Lizzie died of yellow fever and left 3 young children, so both of them died tragic deaths. I mentioned to the old man that he needs to get the newspaper preserved somehow because it was crumbling in our hands. And I offered to take it back to the library at my school and let the librarian see what she could do. It took a while for her to get it back to me. And when I brought it back to the dairy farm, I find out that Mr. Whidden died shortly after I was there. Now, I don't know if the excitement of having my visit and walking up to the top of that hill killed the old man, but he died 10 days later. So here I have this valuable family artifact. I'm going around the community, this farming community, very rural, 12 miles west of Macon. And I'm going around trying to find relatives to give this newspaper to. And what I find out is he doesn't have any relatives. And everybody I talked to claimed to be total authorities on this murder, a murder I had never heard of. Not only did they claim to be authorities, they claimed to be the children and the grandchildren of people that were listed in the newspaper, of people that they said testified at the trial. A lot of them swore their grandma, their grandpa escaped death because they were supposed to be in that house that night. There was about 50 of them. Also, though, I found out very quickly nobody had the same story. Nobody agreed on the details. They didn't agree on the number killed. They didn't agree on the method killing, other than the fact that a lot of them did say there was axe killing, but some said they were shot with shotguns. They didn't agree on who the killer, who was tried, executed. They didn't agree on it. And I wanted to know what's going on, so I went to the archives in Atlanta, and I'm looking at all the documents, the original newspapers, and I've come upon this headline. It's a month after the murders, And this headline just literally comes out of the blue. I'm not expecting it. It throws me for a major loop. And it's what started me on my trail to find the answers to this case. I'm not going to tell you the headline quite yet. You'll learn it in a minute. But I'm going to tell you the first story. This is the basic story that was left behind. And by the way, this is true. August the 6th, 1887, very early in the morning, just before sunrise, the community receives word that the Woolfolk family has been attacked. When they get there, it focuses right out, doesn't it? When it gets there, they go into the Woolfolk house. Now, the Woolfolk house was your typical plantation house, just like your farmhouse. Forget Gone with the Wind and those mansions. There might have been like 20 of them in the state. In this case, the Woolfolk house had a wide hallway, 4 rooms, boys' room, parents' room, girls' room, parlor, and out the back, separate, was the kitchen. When they walked in, they saw a large puddle of blood in the hall between the 2 back bedrooms, tracks leading through the blood, and smears of blood on the wall. Right in that door jamb, right there at the parents' door, waiting for them, covered with blood, brains, and hair, was a short-handled wood axe, just like this. As a matter of fact, it was this axe. Now, when they burned the evidence, I found where they burned it, and I found the axe head. In the parents' room, oh, wait a minute. Shoot. In the parents' room were 6 victims. Now, don't go anywhere. Obviously, the main victim was the father of the household, Captain Richard Woolfolk. He was 56 years old. He was 200 pounds, 6'4". Very healthy, very strong man. In the bed with him was his wife, Mattie. This is the girl I was looking for. And this photograph was taken 2 months before the murders, and here are 3 of the victims. Little Mattie was 18 months old in the bed between her parents, and on the floor by the bed was little 5-year-old Charlie. Beside Charlie was his brother, Dick. Now, at the time of Dick's death, he was 21, but in this photograph, he's about 14 or 15. But when Dick was killed, he was 6'4" and 195 pounds. He was just like his father. He was a strong, healthy, strapping man. Across the foot of the bed was Pearl, Dick's sister. She was 17 at the time of her death. Here she's about 16. Pearl didn't live at the house. She was at college. She came to attend a church picnic the family had scheduled for the next day. That's why she was there. Also there for that picnic was Mattie's 84-year-old great aunt, Temperance West. Now, I do not have a photograph of any of the 3 victims across the hall in the girls' room, but this is what the reporter said it looked like. This is the parents' bedroom, but down in the girls' room, you had 3 victims. In the bed was Aunt Tempy, and also 7-year-old Rosebud, and almost getting out the window. They said her arm was hooked out the window, was 10-year-old Annie. There were 9 victims, but there had been 10 in the house that night, so there was 1 survivor, Tom, the captain's oldest son. This is what Tom said happened. Set up the house. This is the room Tom's in. Tom's bed, Dick and Charlie are in this bed. The parents and little Mattie are in this bed. Pearl and Annie are in this bed, and Rosebud and Aunt Tempy are in this bed. Tom said before sunrise he heard his father cry out. He jumped up to run through that door when his brother Dick darted past him and entered the room ahead of him. And Tom said he heard him get hit and he heard him fall. He knew there was somebody behind that door waiting on him, so he turns around, dives over his bed, jumps out the window, runs down the hill for help, but no one will help him. He goes back up the hill. He said as he approaches the front door, he could hear the killers go out the back door. They were at the well laughing, he said. He sneaks in. He finds his sister Pearl in the hallway. That was her puddle of blood. That was her smears of blood on the wall. He picks her up, carries her, and puts her across the foot of the bed of his parents, and he checks everyone. They're all dead. He comes back outside and he waits for the authorities. Remember that church picnic I told you about? Well, when the word was received that the Woolfolk family who had organized the picnic had been killed, the picnic went to the front porch. They moved to the front yard. So by the time the sheriff got there 6 hours later, at 12 o'clock, there were about 500, 600 people in the front yard having a picnic. Excuse me. Children were swinging on the dead children's swings. Anyway, by the time the sheriff got there, the mob wanted to kill Tom. The coward ran. Children were killed. The sheriff takes him into protective custody. He is later charged with the crimes. He is tried. This is a rare photograph of the crowd waiting for the conviction. He is convicted December the 5th, 1887, and he is executed. And here's a photograph of his old tombstone. But remember, I found the headline I wasn't expecting. And this was the man that was on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution. His name is Jackson DuBose, and the headline says that he has been charged with the murders of the Woolfolk family and that he has confessed. Well, let's find out what his story is. The week of the murders, there's a big jailbreak in Atlanta, Georgia, 100 miles away. 23 men get out. The sheriff in Fulton County sends an all-points bulletin to South Carolina, Tennessee, over to Alabama, and obviously all through Georgia. Said, you pick up every stray, you pick up every drifter, make sure, get them here to us in Atlanta, make sure they're not one of our escaped prisoners. He's found walking the back roads in Cherokee County, which is about 45 miles north of Atlanta. He has scars on his wrist and on his ankles from wearing shackles. He's definitely an ex-con. And he's belligerent. He really causes the sheriff to get suspicious. And so the sheriff decides he's going to arrest him and send him to Atlanta under suspicion of being an escape prisoner. I have said this talk since May of last year, 37,000 miles, and my brain doesn't participate in this anymore. It just ever so often throws information in at the wrong time. Jackson DuBose said when they arrested him under suspicion of being an escaped prisoner, Jackson DuBose says, I wasn't in Atlanta when those guys escaped from jail. I was in Macon when the Woolfolks got killed. He went from the frying pan to the fire immediately. And he had to explain himself. He said, well, I didn't kill them, but I was the lookout for the gang that did. Now listen to what he says. I was with the chain gang that had worked the area. We went back to rob from the old man, but he woke up, so we had to kill him. That woke up the mother. We took a whack at her, missed, hit the baby, had to kill the mother. The whole house was all up. We had to kill them all, but one got out. When I read his statement, I knew the man was telling the truth, because I had just read the coroner's report, and this report never shows up in the trials, says it describes everybody, every angle of the wounds, the number of wounds, how wide, how long, how deep, everything. Very detailed report. I was very impressed with that report for that period of time. And in the report, well, let me just tell you what it says. First, they couldn't find the baby when they went in the house the first time. And they asked Tom, and they said, well, she sleeps with Mom and Pa. So they go and they have to look underneath the dead body of the mother to find the dead body of the baby. Well, but who died first? The baby did. Also, the mother had a glancing blow on her forehead. She was killed from the back of the head, but they said she had a glancing blow. This little part right here was cut off. Now listen to what he says. We went in to rob from the old man, but he woke up, so we had to kill him. We took a whack at the mother and missed. There's that glancing blow. And hit the baby. Baby's dead. And then had to kill the mother. Mother's dead on top of the baby. He was there. He was there because he can't read, he can't write, and this information's not in the newspapers. He's 145 miles away from the murder scene, and he's able to give critical forensic information. And on top of that, as soon as that news hit the headlines hit the newspaper, people started coming forward saying, we saw him at the murder scene the day before and the day after. people could put him at the murder scene. As a matter of fact, Emma Jones, the cook, said that he came up to her door the morning before the murders begging for food. He was there. But then I also read a few weeks later that Cherokee County had to let him go because Bibb County didn't want him. They didn't interview him. And Cherokee County went on the record saying, we believe this man is telling the truth, but we don't have jurisdiction over this case, so we have to let him go. And Bibb County, in justifying why, they were ignoring the witnesses and ignoring what he said. They said, oh, because we know Tom Woolfolk did it, the son. No evidence, no witnesses. He was just the only one there that got out alive. I could not understand this. I wanted to understand, why did Bibb County at least not take the man and talk to him? Why did they just ignore him and let him go? Especially if our history, our culture says that we grabbed the first black man up and lynched him every time, right? You heard that about the South. Well, hello. He was telling names. He listed 4 names of people that witnesses could put at the plantation, people that were still walking around, and all of them were ignored. I wanted to understand, so I went looking. It took me 27 years. For me to understand this, I had to learn some Georgia history. I thought I knew Georgia history because I love Georgia history, but I found out I knew nothing about the 1880s of Georgia. It's not in our history books. You're going to learn a little bit more Georgia history than you ever care to know, but you have to have an idea, just like I had to have an understanding, what was going on in the background behind this case, so that the officials in Bibb County could very easily say, no, he's not our killer, we got our killer. The son of the plantation owner did it. So, what I found out was, now, you're from Iowa, I didn't tell you anything you didn't know. But when Sherman marched to the sea during the Civil War, it was made up mostly of Iowans. Iowans, Indiana, and Illinois marched to the sea through Georgia. Sherman says, I'm going to break the back of the South. I'm going to bring this war to an end. And with 75,000 men, he leaves Atlanta, burns it when he leaves, and with 75,000 men, he marches through Georgia to Savannah, 60 miles wide, 300 miles long, and they burn every cornfield, every cotton crop, every barn, every warehouse, every courthouse, every plantation house, unless you were a Mason, because apparently he was too. That's the legend. But he destroyed Georgia. Up until that point, Georgia was still providing the support of the war. All the other states had pretty much been destroyed, but Georgia was still very wealthy and was still providing. And then they marched through, and it is destroyed. After the war, Georgia doesn't recover. Reconstruction, that's a joke. There was no reconstruction. Atlanta was rebuilt by Northern money. That's it. There was no reconstruction. So now we're in the 1880s, and 1886, the newspapers are full of violence. 1886, 1887. In the year 1887, it was the most violent year in Georgia history. We had more men lynched in that one year than in all the other ones. We had almost 300. We had 297 men. And for every one white man, they lynched 10 black men. So it was a very violent year. And that decade was extremely violent. And I wanted to know, well, then who's doing this? Who's perpetuating this violence onto the civilians? You know, there were homes being invaded constantly, and people were getting killed, but children were not getting killed. And that was the deal. This was the first murder involving children in one of these home invasions. Barns were being burned. People were being held up on the streets and the back roads. A doctor goes to deliver baby, comes back and finds his house burning. Another doctor goes to deliver baby, never makes it because they kill him and take his wagon and his horses. Who's doing this? Well, I found out there were actually 4 groups of marauding men, 4 groups of different gangs that were marauding through the state. The main group, believe it or not, was veterans, homeless veterans. To this day, we have 23,000 homeless Vietnam veterans. The statistics say because they are mentally unstable. The war has destroyed them emotionally. They are so unstable they can't have a home, they can't have a family, they can't have a job, and they're on the streets because they're not crazy enough to be in our asylums. They're homeless. We had the same thing. Back then, we had a lot of soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We had another group of veterans I didn't know about. When Sherman was marching to the sea, we let go our prisoners. We let them go. We let them out. Put a gun in their hand and said, help us defend our state, and you'll be pardoned. Well, after the war, and during this decade, their names are the ones that are the leaders of these gangs. It says in the newspapers, in jail for murder, released, fought for the war. Now he's a veteran, but he was a gang member. He's the leader of the gang. There was another group of veterans that I didn't know about. You know, a lot of Iowans, Illinoisans, and Indianans didn't go home after the war. When Sherman marched through, there were deserters hopping out of that army like fleas off a dog. And they stayed behind. And they stayed as gangs. There was another group of gangs. Freed slaves. Now, most all of them went back to the plantation, and family units went back to the plantation to work. You know, what happened to the slaves when they were freed is so sad in the sense that they were not transitioned. They were told, get off the plantation, you're free, but free to do what? All they knew was the plantation. There was no employment. Unemployment was 75-80% that year. There was no work. Most of the men that had a trade practiced their trade. Blacksmiths, builders, carpenters. Most of the women, some of the most successful stories of families come from the women. They started their own businesses. The first restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia was by a black woman. After the burning of Atlanta. The first restaurant was built by a black woman, a freed slave. They built their businesses. But there was a group that was determined they were not going to go and work for any white man anywhere. Now I want you to think inner city gang. We have bad in Atlanta. We have our Puerto Rican gang. We have our Mexican American gang. We have our African American gang. We have our white gang. We have Chinese gang. I mean, we just have gangs, and they're ethnic, and they stick together, but they put their violence on the defense of civilians. We had that. Young black men who were determined they were not going to work for white men, and they took their chances out on these back roads too. Violence was bad, and guess what? Now we've got another group. They threw on their white sheets, they're vigilantes, they're going around, and they're bringing law and order to Georgia. Problem is the people that they caught and lynched were usually innocent because the people that did the violence were too powerful and long gone. The KKK. They called themselves the Knights at the time. All of that violence. Georgia already had on the books it's against the law to kill, against the law to rape, against the law to arson, against the law to steal. So they added a new law to the books, and this was the strongest law in the state. It was against the law to be unemployed. If you were found walking through my county, and I'm the sheriff, or one of my patrolmen, and you couldn't prove that you were employed, I would arrest you, sentence you to 30 days on the chain gang, chain you to 15 other men, black and white, they were not segregated. And then I would rent you back to the plantation, which were called work farms, and you would be worked for 30 days. Now what were we doing? We were creating gangs and putting them on the most defenseless group of people. The plantations were only occupied by father, mother, and few children, and a few sharecroppers' families, mostly children on these plantations. After the 30 days, you were then escorted off the property line, not back to the county seat, off the property line. The shackles were taken off of your ankles, and the shackles were taken back to the courthouse, and you were let go. The Woolfolk Farm was a work farm. Sometimes if the job wasn't done, like the harvest wasn't completed, you would hire back as a field hand to get the job done, to get in the cotton crop. At the time of the murders, there were 4 field hands that had been a part of a previous chain gang that were working off the cotton crop. Remember what Jackson DuBose said? I was with a chain gang. We went back to rob from the old man. Well, Georgia's not making it. Georgia has killing unemployment. It is not surviving the destruction of the war, even now, 20 years later. So the leading citizens of Georgia go to New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey to industrial conventions. Come to Georgia. Look at all this manpower we've got. Look at all of this land we've got. And the northern industrialists refused. They said, we didn't fight a war to end slavery, and this is a quote, for you to have another form of slavery in the convict lease system. It's evil, it's corrupted, it's violent. We're not coming to Georgia. 1886, there were 6 such conventions, and in 1887, the week of the murders, almost every major leading citizen in Georgia wasn't in Georgia. They were at one of these conventions in New York. The governor, Henry Grady, the owner and editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Judge James T. Simmons, the judge from Macon, William Felton, State House Representative from Macon. These men received telegrams at this convention just the night before the governor had defended the convict lease system as a moral, just program. The family's home is invaded, but this time children are killed, and within weeks, a convict gang is suspected. You're caught up. Now let's start talking about the real case. For me to understand, I went looking for the records, and there aren't any records in Bibb County Courthouse about this murder. All the trial records are gone. I tracked the indictments. This is one of 9 indictments. I tracked it down in California, in personal property possession in California. That's why it took me 27 years. This stuff's all over the country. This is for one of 9 indictments against Tom for the murder of Maddie. It's signed by these 3 men, foreman of the grand jury, Solicitor General, and C.W. Howard. This is C.W. Howard. Now, C.W. Howard, the records show and the newspapers show he's a very powerful man in Macon, Georgia. He's not prosecutor, even though he signs as prosecutor. The judge allows him a lot of leadway. He participates in all the trials. He has all this emotion and this energy. He's the murdered mother's brother. He's the son of Ben Howard, the most powerful man, largest landowner in Bibb County. And I'm thinking, well, this man's got a little too much participation in this case. He's the grieving brother. Who's letting him get away with all of this? This is Judge George Washington Guston. He's the man that tries and executes Tom. There's a problem here immediately. He's not the judge at the time of the murders. James T. Simmons is the judge. This man is not even a criminal attorney at the time of the murders. He's a real estate attorney. He and his partner, Hall, Guston and Hall, handle all the real estate transactions for the powerful Ben Howard, largest landowner in Bibb County, Charles Howard, who is sitting at the bench as prosecutor, and Maddie Howard, the murdered mother. This man is now judge, and he's got an incredible conflict of interest here. Now, how did he become judge? Well, I had to go and find out that. A month before the murders, a Supreme Court justice from Georgia turned 85 years old, and he's interviewed, and they say, "Are you going to retire from the bench?" He goes, "No, I can live to be 100. I'm healthy." He's part of that delegation that goes to New York. A week after they return, a week after the murders, he resigns immediately from the bench. The governor, who was part of that delegation, calls this emergency judicial committee and State House representatives meeting. We've got to have a new Supreme Court justice. William Felton, State House representative from Bibb County, who's the chairman of this committee, who was part of that delegation, immediately nominates James T. Simmons from Macon, Georgia, who was part of that delegation. He's the judge that would have tried this case. The governor immediately approves the position, appointment. Then the governor went, "Whoa, we've got the murder of the century. I don't have a judge. Give me a judge." And William Felton immediately nominates Judge George Washington Guston. He's the least qualified attorney in the county to be a trial attorney. Mercer, the biggest law school in the South, is in Macon, Georgia. There are so many qualified potential judges in that county alone in the state. None of them are considered the least qualified. The attorney for Ben Howard is made judge to try this case. His first trial, Tom's trial, he's found guilty. The Supreme Court of Georgia throws it out immediately, said you did not control your courtroom, you did not control the violence. The jury felt intimidated. It was not a fair trial. Try him again. So the first conviction was thrown out. Trial 2, mistrial, jury tampering, and guess who's accused of it? Charles Howard, sitting at the prosecution table. The brother of the murdered mother is accused of tampering with the jury. He is not sanctioned. They just proclaim a mistrial. Trial 3, mistrial. They can't get a jury. They can't find anybody who hasn't read this newspaper alone. And most people who thought Tom might be innocent of the killing felt he should die because he was a coward and the baby got killed. The majority of the people in the county felt that. There was a diary that I found that was the most boring diary I had ever read. This lady was 87 years old, perfect handwriting. She wrote about the weather and the flowers and the gardens and the socials and who the preacher was and what he preached and who got married and what they wore. But there's a part in the diary where it's just raging handwriting, and it says, that Tom Woolfolk, the coward, I hope they hang him. Anyway, they do a change of venue to this place. Now, it means nothing to you, Houston County, Perry, Georgia, but in Georgia, when they see the slide that the change of venue went to Houston County, everybody'd be laughing right about now because this is the next door county. This is the county right next door, 20 miles away. The courthouses are 20 miles apart. The problem with this county, you know, when you do a change of venue, it's to get away from the media hysteria, all the emotion, right? I'm not telling you nothing you don't know. Well, this change of venue, the defense kept saying, send it to Savannah, send it to Brunswick, send it away. And he sent it to the next county over that is just as emotionally charged about this case as this county was, because the murdered victims had relatives in the next county over. As a matter of fact, the largest landowner in Houston County was the brother of the murdered father, and the largest political citizen, the one that says you vote for so-and-so, and you voted for so-and-so, was Maddie's uncle, Uncle John, Ben Howard's brother. The two most powerful people in Houston County were relatives of the murdered victims. Well, anyway, trial 4. The jury now is brought out of Houston County. All the people trying the case, judge and everybody's from Bibb County. The jury's from Houston County. Trial 4, mistrial. The problem this time was that the jury kind of said too soon that they thought Tom was innocent and they thought he was getting railroaded. It was basically, why are we trying this case? And the judge had not asked for their opinion yet when they gave it to him. And he proclaimed a mistrial immediately. So now we're at trial 5. It's been 3 years. Tom has been chained to the wall of his cell these 3 years. Now I don't mean chained like in the old dungeon, you know, Dark Ages, but he had shackles riveted onto his ankles, and then a chain riveted to the shackles, and then bolted to the wall. He was chained. During these 3 years, the defense kept trying to get the judge to disqualify himself. Conflict of interest. And he says, no, I can try this case. Yet when the extended Howards and the extended Woolfolk family looked back and saw this 1,000-acre plantation, 1,000-acre plus plantation in a screwed up will, they sued each other to get the land. And it went before Judge Guston, who immediately disqualified himself for conflict of interest because, he said in the records, I drew up most of the transactions for this family. I was, after all, Maddie's personal attorney. Yet, he could not He could not fairly judge land dispute, because he was her attorney, but he could judge the man accused of killing her. Also during these 3 years, witnesses have died or disappeared. Some of the leading witnesses were those 4 field hands that people said were the men that Jackson DuBose had identified to be the killers. They were the state's leading witnesses against Tom. Well, they just kind of disappeared after the first trial. They didn't hang around. But there were some other leading witnesses, and they died from old age. State doesn't have a case. The defense is really surprised that the 5th trial is called. You see, the state now has a new Solicitor General try in this case, a new Attorney General. Remember William Felton, House Representative who nominated the judges? Well, he resigned from the House and is appointed acting Attorney General by the governor, and he is now trying this case. The judge owes his position to the man now trying this case. He's basically told, you get a conviction. There are no witnesses, but now they have William Felton, and he's got something up his sleeve. These men. This is a list of witnesses that testified against Tom at that last trial. But look at this document closely. It says murder. These men testified against Tom at trial 5. But this document is the list of jurors and their alternates that found Tom guilty in the first trial. Remember that trial that was thrown out because it wasn't fair? Well, Felton calls these men as witnesses. They are now testifying for the state. When you're called as a witness, you have direct information on the case, not because you were a part of a jury that found him guilty and then the case was thrown out. The conviction was thrown out because it was not fair. Well, this is what he wanted to do, and the judge allowed it. I keep wanting to say governor. The judge allowed it. He wanted to read transcripts of testimonies of the now dead or missing witnesses, and he wanted to read them to these men after they're sworn in, and he wanted their opinion. Did you believe him? Did he come across like he was telling the truth? Also, because they didn't have any evidence, it had been either missing or was tampered with, the only thing they still had was the axe, and it was the only thing that was still sound. All the other evidence was missing or tampered with, so the jury had nothing to see except the axe. And so he asked these men to describe the evidence. They saw it at the first trial, so they're now describing evidence that the jury can't see. Well, the judge allowed this. Let me tell you what the judge didn't allow. Jackson DuBose had been let go. Well, the defense finally caught him and brought him back. And he was going to testify. Judge wouldn't allow it. As a matter of fact, he was proclaimed without trial. He was proclaimed insane, committed to an asylum, but it shows on the books that he was charged with killing the Woolfolk families. That was never made public. The sheriff from Cherokee County that arrested Jackson DuBose, that went on the record saying, I believe this man, he was brought in. Sheriff would not let him testify to that. The judge would not let him testify to that. Emma Jones, the cook, who could put Jackson DuBose at the murder scene the day before and the day after, she was not allowed to testify to that. Witnesses that could put Jackson DuBose within 10 miles, less than a week later, were not allowed to testify to that. Witnesses that could put the field hands that Jackson DuBose had identified as the real killers, having a physical fight with the captain 3 days before the murders when he was trying to throw them off his property, they could not testify to that. There was a constable transferring a prisoner through Macon, Georgia. He stops at the depot. She gets out of control. He gets this guy. He says, I'll pay you 25 cents if you'll help me transport her. And the man, who, by the way, was later identified to be one of these field hands, went crazy. He got real enraged. He said, you're no different than the damn Woolfolk who wanted to pay me 25 cents for getting his cotton in, and I'm going to make him pay. There were witnesses that could put the people that Jackson DuBose identified at the depot and they were arguing about something. They didn't let Miss Fletcher, the boarding house lady, judge didn't allow Miss Fletcher, the boarding house lady, to testify. She said, now she had a boarding house in Macon, Georgia, and she said, Tom didn't even live at the plantation. He was at my boarding house a week before the murders. Dick comes in from the plantation, and in my presence, I heard Dick say to Tom, Pa's having problems at the farm. He can't get rid of some hands. They won't leave. We need your help. And that's why Tom went, shirt on his back. None of these people were allowed to testify. A judge from a neighboring county who could testify that he heard one of the men that Jackson DuBose identified as the real killer brag about getting away with murder a week later after the murders. He was not allowed to testify. The judge did not allow any of those people to testify. The jury never heard it, and Tom was found guilty. When the appeal goes to the Supreme Court of Georgia, it goes to Judge James T. Simmons, who writes back saying, I'm not going to recommend this for review. The Supreme Court of Georgia never saw the appeal about these men as witnesses. They never saw the appeal. Simmons said, I'm not recommending this for review. They go to Tom and say, what do you want to do? Do you want to appeal to the governor and Tom, or to the Supreme Court? And Tom says, no. My life is over. My family is dead. I'm tired. I will not spend another day in jail. Well, let me show you what Tom looked like. Surprisingly enough, Tom was a little man. He had this huge father, huge brother, but Tom was a little man. He took after his mother, not Maddie. See, Maddie was the captain's second wife. When Tom was 5 years old, the war came to an end, 1865, and before the captain got home from war, his wife died. Tom's mother died from complications from his birth. She was a tiny, tiny little frail woman. She had already had 2 children before Tom, and by the time he was born, by the time he becomes 5 years old, she has never gotten out of bed. She finally dies. And 2 years later, the captain is bankrupt. He has got 3 motherless children. He is losing his plantation, and the powerful Ben Howard buys the plantation from him. A week later, the captain marries Ben Howard's only daughter, and then the land is given back to them jointly. But technically, she owned the land. Father couldn't do anything without her permission. She was basically the co-signer. She had to sign every document pertaining to the land. At the time of the murders, Tom was 5'8". Well, his sister Pearl was 5'7.5". He was 140 pounds. Pearl was 135 pounds. Trust me, Pearl alone could take that man on, and do a damage to him. And yet they said he took that short-handled wood axe and fought 5 adults, 4 children, and killed them all, none getting out. At the execution, Houston County has to execute him. And the Houston County Sheriff goes on record saying, I believe the man's innocent, but I have to carry out the law. On the scaffold, Tom begs him, please make sure the noose is right. And then he forgives everybody, including the sheriff that's about to kill him. He says, I did not hold you responsible for this. He prays and he forgives everybody for what they have done to him and what they are about to do to him. And then when the trap door is pulled, the noose slips, and he strangles for 17 minutes. They said he was still kicking 17 minutes later. This is what the Atlanta Constitution said it looked like. Apparently, this is Tom. But I'm not through with this guy. I love that. A week after the murders, he orders the evidence destroyed. 3 boxes are taken behind the jail and burned. That's how I found the axe. It was the only thing left. The handle was burned, but the axe head was there. And then he resigns from the bench. He tried no other murder case but Tom's case. He resigns from the bench and he starts a law firm. William Felton, who had tried the case, tries to get his state house position back, his state house representative's job back. He runs for election, and he runs on the platform, the man who executed Tom Woolfolk, but he loses the election. See, the majority of the people in the state thought Tom was a coward. Now, you can't be a coward and a killer at the same place. They didn't think Tom did it. They just thought he should die because he was a coward. This judge, when he resigned from the bench, he took all the other prosecutors. Felton's gone. He took all the other prosecutors, 6 of them, and they form a law firm called Gustin and Associates. The law firm is immediately appointed by the state of Georgia to handle the incorporation paperwork and the land transaction of all this industry that is now streaming in to Georgia from New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. This man, before he dies, is a millionaire, and he is credited for bringing in the Industrial Revolution, which started, according to our records, in November 1890. Tom was executed in October of 1890. Well, wait a minute. Industry wasn't going to come down because of the convict lease system, right? Well, during those 3 years, while they were trying to get Tom executed, they did away with that program very quietly. It just all of a sudden stopped. But they still have this killing. And the rumors are that a gang did it, which substantiated what the Northern Industrialists said all along, that it was violent, evil system. But lo and behold, there's an execution, a trial and an execution of the son. It's been proven that it was a domestic killing. Industry streams in. I'm not through. You're almost through, though. Less than a year after the execution, near the railroad track in Louisiana, there's a plantation home invaded just before sunrise. They're axed to death. Short-handled wood axe is left at the door. They notified Bibb County. Are you sure the Woolfolk killer was executed? Because we think he's over here now. No, we got our man. He did it. Then it happens in Alabama. Near the railroad track, a plantation home is invaded. They're axed to death. Short-handled wood axe left at the door. Same conversation between the officials. No, we got our guy. Then it happened again in Georgia. Near the railroad track, plantation home, just before sunrise, axed to death. Short-handled wood axe. Same conversation. Bibb County's getting a little tired of being asked this. As a matter of fact, the other sheriff says, you know, we think, they never used the word serial killer or mass murderer. Why? Those were never came up. Wouldn't that have been incredible to have used that term back then, because that's what they had, was a serial mass murderer. Bibb County says, no, Tom Woolfolk did our killing. They even said, you know, it looks like it started with the Woolfolk family, and they even said there's a pathway on the railroad track. Tom Woolfolk did our killing. Then it happens in South Carolina, near the railroad track. Plantation homes invaded. Family is axed to death. But something different happens. This time the screams are heard. The neighbors respond. And they respond in time. They look out in time to see a field hand is running up the lane in response to the screams. And they see a gang of 4 run out of the house, and they see the leader of the gang. He's identified to be Cooper, Simon Cooper. He's a huge man. He runs up to the field hand, and he hits him square on top of the head with a short-handled wood axe. Of course, the axe beds into his skull. The man drops dead. And witnesses, the whole neighborhood is up. They're responding. They're getting on their horses. They're getting their guns. The gang is going, let's go, let's go. And the witnesses said he took the time to try to get that axe out of the man's head. They said he was determined to get the axe out. And he even went so far as, because the man just literally dropped to his knees, he went so far as to put his foot on the man's shoulder, trying to get the axe out. And he can't. And they said he just throws up his hands, relinquishes the axe, he can't get it. They gallop off, and as they gallop by, they actually shoot at the responding neighbors. In other words, they had guns, but the Wilson family is axed to death. They finally get one of the gang members. He's a local half-wit, and when they get him, the sheriff says, you're a chicken thief, you're not a killer. What are you doing with this gang? And he said, now listen to him. He said, Simon Cooper convinced us that we could go in and rob from the old man, but he woke up. Cooper went crazy, killed them all. Who'd that sound like to you? Jackson DuBose. Anyway, they found Cooper And this gang member warns him. He says, Cooper is armed to the teeth with guns, but he likes to cut. That's his favorite way of killing, cutting. Well, they finally find Cooper. He's in a shack, and he is armed to the teeth, and he holds off this posse for like 15 hours. And finally, they're through with it. They're going to blow up the shack, him in it. And he gives himself up. And the editor of the newspaper writing this article says, when he emerged from the house, he immediately intimidated everybody that was there because he was 6'6". He was light-skinned. 6'6", 300 pounds. His hands were outstretched. His voice was strong and booming. And he says, "You can't kill me. I'm the angel of death. God sent me to earth to bring vengeance onto the head of the southern white man for what he did to my African brothers." That's a quote. Well, who is Simon Cooper, for crying out loud? Well, first of all, they had been looking for him already for about a month because he'd killed 4 people in public. So they were already looking for him. And now by this time he's gotten a little gang up and they've invaded the Wilson house. Cooper was the grandson, according to the records, he was the grandson of a slave and a plantation owner outside Charleston, South Carolina, but he was raised by the plantation owner. Now let's talk about this plantation owner for just a brief second. South Carolina had on the books a law for several hundred years that you could not whip lashes. You could not render more than 300 lashes onto the back of a slave. More than that, you've killed him. You cannot, in one whipping, hit him more than 300 times. Simon Cooper's grandfather broke that law when he was 6 years old 4 times. He was also in trouble with the sheriff for almost killing his wife twice. This is in 1 year. Almost killing his son and actually killing a squatter on his land, having him beaten to death. What was this man doing? Well, he was definitely raising a monster. Well, the posse was taking Simon Cooper in, and the mob took over, wounded several members of the posse, and got Simon Cooper away and lynched him. The sheriff went back into the shack, and he found bundles of letters not mailed. Remember the Unabomber? His shack in Montana? The FBI said when they went in, they found stacks of letters not mailed. In these letters, in both cases, they were talking about, raving about their mission from God. The Unabomber was diagnosed as a sociopath, and I can only imagine that so would Simon Cooper, based on that same association. Well, they found also that he left behind a will. So the man was educated. He was cared for by his grandfather. Left behind a will, and in this will he says, to C.J. Taylor in Macon, Georgia, I leave behind the trunk he's holding for me. So they get word over to Macon, Georgia. The editor of the newspaper gets a correspondent to go over there. And when they go to C.J. Taylor, he is a railroad man. His house is near the railroad tracks. They say, "Do you know Simon Cooper?" Well, yeah, I knew him. How'd you know him? Well, he turned up at my house looking for work, but he just disappeared a couple of days later. When was that? Oh, I'll never forget. It was the day after the Woolfolks were killed. See, the Woolfolk killing was our Pearl Harbor, our John F. Kennedy assassination, Challenger explosion. We knew where we were when we heard it. And so did they at the Woolfolk, knew where they were when they heard the Woolfolk killing. Well, they go and they find the trunk, and the sheriff is going through it, and the reporter sees a small little notebook, and he gets it and he's reading it. This is the article he wrote about it. It was Cooper's Diary of Crimes. You see, if you're on a mission from God, you can't trust anybody to keep the records accurately. You keep your own records. And and Cooper was very proud of fulfilling his mission. And it was a diary of crimes, his Georgia Diary of Crimes. It says in one place, he listed people he killed, people he robbed, members of his own gang he killed. I mean, he just listed it all. But there was, and he said, there are 19 unsolved killings in this state that when it becomes known, I'll go down as Georgia's greatest criminal mind. And that was before his last entry, which was his August entry, 1887, and he writes about the Woolfolk family, and he describes it exactly the way Jackson DuBose said it happened. He even went so far to say that it was an accident to kill the baby. He had planned for her to grow up to be a silent witness to his greatness. She would never be able to identify who did it, And anytime anybody saw her, they'd remember the killing and therefore remember him. And he regretted the death of the baby. He also said Tom Woolfolk got out, but he fixed him. He fixed him good. That's what it says in the diary. And I think what that means is, remember those 4 men that testified against Tom, that everybody else said were the people that Jackson DuBose had identified? Well, they stayed behind and they testified against Tom that first trial. I think that's what he meant when he said, but I fixed him good. He got away. I tracked Simon Cooper to the Woolfolk place. His father worked on the plantation right next door. They were not a mile away, 2 houses. London Cooper was Simon Cooper's father. He even shows up working on the Yates farm. He even shows, which is the neighboring farm, he even shows up as being on chain gangs off and on in the county. The man was there. The Woolfolk place was never inhabited after the murders. Who would? So it sort of reverted back to nature. When you go there, you see the evidence of the house. This is the well where he said he heard the gang laughing when he snuck up the front door. And this is the other chimney rubble, pile of chimney rock. This is Tom's room over here. This is the parents' room here. And right where I'm standing when I took the photograph is where I say the short-handled wood axe was left behind. That's about where the door was. And this tree right here, when I started this research, it was that big. That's how bad it was. Look how thick the woods are. Imagine me finding that place. The Woolfolk plantation, 1,000+ acres, was a valley, a beautiful valley. And through the middle of it was Tobesofkee Creek, which is a pretty good-sized river. And it turned the captain's sawmill and grits mill, operated for him. When, in 1960, they dammed up Tobesofkee Creek, by the way, they flooded the sawmills. They were there even in 1960. I can't get to them. I'm not a scuba diver. They flooded the plantation. They flooded the whole valley. And now they have Lake Tobesofkee, which is a beautiful recreational lake. The Woolfolk house site, though, is still above water, and it's right there. And when you get to it, you walk around, you still find Woolfolk artifacts. I found a little teacup, a perfect teacup the other day. Plow parts, brass harness workings. Oh, it was a very nice, wealthy family. 12 miles away in Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon, Georgia, you got 9 unmarked graves. The only marking is this step right here that says Woolfolk, but it usually is covered with grass. That is the captain, Maddie, Aunt Temp, there's Dick, Pearl, Annie, Rosebud, Charlie, and little Maddie. 45 miles away in Hawkinsville, Georgia, at Orange Hill Cemetery, you have Tom's grave. The night before he was to be executed, he begged his older sisters, he says, do not bury me in Bibb County. Not because he didn't want to be buried near his family, but because he had been receiving death threats. And then when it became apparent that he was going to be executed, the threats changed. Then he started receiving threats saying, we're going to dig your body up and drag it through the streets, you coward. Also, he says, concrete my coffin into the vault. Don't make it to where they can dig me up. Well, I know for a fact that he's concreted in. 2 things tell me that. The first one is, if in the undertaker's paperwork, there's a ticket, extra load of concrete, family request. But that's not what convinces me. You see, this cemetery is right next to the Ocmulgee River, which is about as big as the Des Moines River. Maybe the Cedar River. Des Moines. I've gone over them so much these 3 weeks, I go, oh yeah, okay, it's Des Moines. This cemetery is right against the Ocmulgee River, and in 1994 it flooded. And this corner of the cemetery was underwater. As a matter of fact, the water was about a foot above Tom's tombstone. And the newspaper said there's a problem. Coffins that do not have the graves that do not have the capstone, coffins are popping up out of the ground, even some that are 100, 200 years old, floating around. They said all but one. I'm going, whoa, I hired a motorboat. The man thought I was crazy. You ever try to find a tombstone above it? floating around trying to find Tom's grave, because I was thinking, is his grave, has his, air pressure, coffin popped up? His is the one. Water was a foot above the grave, and his coffin was never relinquished from the ground. He's concreted in. Look at his tombstone, though. The vandals still got a hold of it. If you wouldn't know it's his grave, it wasn't for the fact that they put his parents' names on it. And you see the white streaks? I was told that by a monument maker, that's etched into the granite, by the way. And he said he's seen it before on these old tombstones, especially if they've been hit by a rotten egg in the early morning dew. He said the hydrogen sulfide from the rotten egg reacts with the water and the dew and produces a weak sulfuric acid that etches into the stone. And that's his theory. But look at it. You can see the egg. You see where it splattered and you can see where it dripped down. And it's not there. It's etched into the stone. I call the book Shadow Chasers because when I was, the prosecutor said, anyone who thinks Tom Woolfolk is innocent is just chasing after shadows. Well, I'm convinced he's innocent. I believe the state needed to make sure the murder stayed domestic so that it could get its industry in. I'm convinced of it. I'm going to read from the book just a little bit. I was told at one little program, as soon as I got into Iowa last year when I started my tour, I forgot, and I said, are there any questions? And I forgot to read. And the lady sitting right there with a cane tapped me on the ankles. I thought she had a question. She went, authors are supposed to read. And I'm like, notice how far away I get now? But I read. I never forget that. I said, what? I'm glad she did that. The book is true. It's written like a novel, but I made up nothing. I did not make up the weather. I did not make up conversations. I did not make up chain of events, because these people told what they did. They recorded in their diaries, in their letters, in interviews, in testimonies, conversations that they had. And I just searched the weather. Most of the time, that lady's diary helped me out. This is based on the testimony of Emma Jones. She was the cook, and her husband Aaron was the sharecropper. And this is based on what they said happened. Emma Jones stirred. The silver rays of a bright full moon gradually illuminated her bedroom, then faded again in the clouded night. She turned over and closed her eyes. There were hours yet before dawn and work. The incessant barking of a dog in the distance continued to annoy her. She closed her eyes and waited patiently for the captain or one of his boys to hush it up. Instead, the lone hound was joined by a loud, frenzied chorus. The snarling, yapping, howling brought Emma to her feet. "What's going on up there?" she groaned aloud. Her husband, Aaron, grumbled an incoherent response and stirred slightly. He was not fully awake. Emma remembered that Miss Mattie, the captain's wife, kept a lantern lit every night in the main hall of the big house. She knew if she looked up at the summit of the terraced hill, there'd be the lights and shadows of activity. There was no light. The young woman stood at the window. Her eyes were transfixed upon the distant grayness of the captain's house. The hounds continued their relentless barking, proclaiming to the countryside that something was terribly wrong at the Woolfolk house. As if a bolt of lightning had suddenly cut a brilliant, jagged path of the night sky, a scream, followed immediately by another, ripped the darkness at the top of the hill and shot a flash of terror through the startled woman standing alone in her window in her cabin 1,000 yards away. There was still no light. A third scream, and a loud guttural, "Oh, Lord!" seemed to thunder down the hill and penetrate her room. Emma caught her breath. She knew the voice. "Miss Mattie," she whispered, as sounds of slapping and screams of terror and pain exploded from the Woolfolk house. Aaron, finally disturbed by the commotion, joined her as she ran into the front room with her small two-room shack. His brute strength nearly ripped the front door off its rusty hinges. The couple stood in the doorway and listened. Dogs barking and cows bellowing were the only sounds. The lone structure at the top of the hill stood silent in the darkness. Off in the distance, someone called out for Anderson James, a neighbor. Then silence. Experience told Aaron to take Emma inside the cabin and turn his back to the trouble. He learned the lesson early in life. Stay out of white folks' business. The farm laborer gently pulled his anxious wife back inside, closed the door, and latched it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So are the effects of the plantation system still being felt in the South?
Perfect question. Yes. As a matter of fact, a professor at the Georgia State University, history professor, wrote a book a few years ago. It vindicated my book because in my book, I am accusing our icons. We've got statues to these people that I am saying were corrupted and railroaded an innocent man. And interesting thing about timing, his book came out the same time mine did, but his was a scholarly work, and it says our icons in the state in the 1880s were extremely corrupted. But he said they were good people. And this was an interesting analogy he put. He said this was a very desperate time and the state of Georgia was not surviving the destruction of the war. It was, by 20 years, it was clear. And he said that we were in a desperate situation, and had the men not done what they did, he said Georgia would be no different today than Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and South Carolina. Look at your statistics. The lowest education test scores, the lowest, the highest unemployment rate, the lowest per capita income, the least amount of industry. I mean, the worst of worst are in those 4 states in our nation. And his premise was, they have yet to survive the war. And they haven't. The race relations are bad in these states. The economy is terrible in these states. The social structure is terrible in these states. Now, there are no major cities. Well, New Orleans. But their major cities are our minor cities in Georgia. He said that North Carolina brought in industry, Tennessee brought in industry, and Georgia brought in industry. By the way, Florida's never included. You know, it's not a Yankee state. It just it's full of Yankees. You know, they all retired and went to Florida. But yes, you're a good question. To this day, we are, and it's not as bad in Georgia, but in the South, the war is still being fought. Race relationships are still bad. My great-grandparents owned slaves. My mother, however, was a descendant of a Sioux Indian in Santee Reservation in Nebraska. So, you know, I've got that side. Thank goodness I've got the pioneer side on my family. But yeah, it's still causing problems. Georgia very quietly got the Confederate battle flag off of its state flag. Mississippi voted in a majority not to. See, it's still being fought. Yes, ma'am?
Why do you think you got conviction to bring in?
Because she came in late. She wasn't not paying attention.
She's very smart.
She's very smart, but she came in late. Otherwise, you're going to look at her going, well, duh. I explained at the very beginning before you got here, and I don't mean to make her. I don't mean to make you blush. There was the state had a high unemployment, had no industry. It was not surviving, had not survived the war, and this delegation kept going north that year to industrial states. And we had a program called the Convict Lease System where the gangs were rented back to the plantation for 30 days, and they were like really worked as slaves. And when the delegations went north to try to get industry to come down, the industrialists refused. And they said, we didn't fight a war to free the slaves for you to have slavery. It's an evil, corrupted, violent system. And the week of the murders, this delegation, including the governor, is at one of these conventions defending the system. When the murders occurred, the son was taken in because he was a coward. He ran, and the mob wanted to kill him, the coward. But very quickly, somebody was caught, and he turned up. He said it was a gang that did it. He was part of the gang, and witnesses came forward. But then a judge was replaced, and things started shuffling around to make it domestic. Because I believe if the real killers had been brought to trial, then it would have justified what the Northern Industrialists said, and industry wouldn't have come in. Yes, sir?
In the photograph of the mother and the 2 children,
Yes.
there seems to be something congenitally wrong with the 2 children.
You know, I have had that question asked, and I have, and not the little girl, but definitely in Charlie. somebody asked me, was he a Down syndrome baby? And the woman that asked me, she says, I'm a mother of a Down syndrome baby. He looks Down syndrome. It does not say anywhere in the records that he was a Down, well, they wouldn't have called it that, they would have called it mongoloid, but they never said it. We were looking at the picture, and if anything, we realized she's got her hand, other than the broad, but see, all of them had, even Pearl has that wideness right here, but the rest of it, I think she's got him twisted, and she just kind of went, be still, and he just went, you can look at it, and her hand is definitely holding him tight, and frankly, he just looks like he's been crying, and because it's not mentioned anywhere, and if he was trust me, the press would have played up that the poor little boy was, killed, but no, I don't think so. I agree with you, it looks like it. Any other question? Yes, ma'am.
I know that you did this book a long time after this incident happened, but things seemed like they're probably slow to change in Georgia. I mean, didn't anyone try to squelch your research?
No, as a matter of fact, well, first of all, nobody had heard about this case. So everybody's going like, what murder?
But descendants of the people who...
Well, they were actually the biggest supporters. The Howard family that railroaded Tom, his grandson, Charles Howard's grandchildren, 2 daughters and 2 grandson and granddaughters, were my biggest helpers. They were my biggest supporters. They said they grew up convinced Tom was innocent. As a matter of fact, they accused finally, and these are elderly people, that the old man Howard abused them as children, because anytime they wanted to spite him, they would say, we don't think Tom did it. And he would get them, and and one lady said he would beat the snot out of them. And she said, we learned very quickly not to say that he just got real violent. Also, when he died, young Charles became old Charles. He died a bitter old man, she said. And she said he was delirious for a couple of days. And when they stood around, one of them made the observation, it sounds like he's trying to convince himself and God that Tom did it, because he was raving about Tom. Now think about that. He died an old man, and here he is raving about Tom. So the man was very bitter. But the supporters, the State House of Representatives have been in touch with me. They're thinking about putting a proposal to the governor of having Tom cleared. And they wanted... I'm tired. I have been doing this for 27 years, not this, but researching it, and now I've been touring for a whole year talking about this case. My opinion is, not my opinion, what I'm trying to do, 2 things. I'm trying to raise money for the libraries, the Friends of the Library. When you buy a book tonight, 40% is given back to the library by my publisher. And 60%, trust me, that RV is drinking it up in gas. When we planned this, gas was like $1.10 up here, and now it's like almost $2, and it is in Chicago. It's sad in Chicago. So this is being no money maker for my publisher, and it is a fundraiser for each library I go to, and I have talked to this program 100+ times. Somebody says, why do it? Well, Tom, he didn't care that the governor thought he was guilty, that the judge thought he was guilty, that the lawyers thought the sheriff. He had no respect for that group. It bothered him, though, that the everyday farmer would think him capable of killing his family, his father especially. So what bothered him was he was convicted in public opinion. That grieved him. That's why he went to his death. He says, my life is over, because of the public opinion was so hard against him. Well, I'm clearing his name by public opinion. But the State House has got in touch with me, and they've even offered to pay me to put together the case to defend and have Tom's name cleared. And it really surprised them, because I went, no, that's your job. Y'all, I said, State House and William Felton's what caused all this mess. Y'all clean up your own mess. Seriously. And everybody's going, but you can get him cleared. I don't want to get involved in that. I'm not fighting that battle. That is their battle. If they so choose, they can clear it. The research is there. It's all in my book. The references are all there. I'll give them my bibliography, which in the book is only about 1/4 of all my records. and let them do it themselves. Let their little law students that are helping them out help. But I'm not fighting that battle. But the state is, the Atlanta Constitution, Henry Grady's baby. We got statues to Henry Grady all over Atlanta and the state. Atlanta Constitution had a big half-page article saying they thought Tom was innocent. And the Macon Telegraph, this Macon Telegraph today, the present-day Macon Telegraph wrote 2.5 full pages saying they thought Tom was innocent. So I've stirred up the pot. I've almost wore myself out doing it, and I am through a week from today. I go back home. I take 3 weeks off. My agent said, because there's a movie deal being negotiated, I'm like, huh? Yeah, well, I ain't driving that RV. That RV is getting parked, you know. But I'm going to go on a hike. My agent said, why don't you take a hike? You know, just get it out of your system, take a hike. And I went, good idea. I'm going to hike the Appalachian Trail. And that's 2,000 miles. And she went, not that long of a hike. And I said, you just find me, you know. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't it stir you up to want to, I mean, there must be. I mean, how many people out there possibly being executed?
I have every program, almost every program, and when I usually say this, then it doesn't happen. Somebody will say, oof, I'm not going to do that. But at almost every program, somebody comes to me with a murder. Either a family member or an old murder, like the Valeska murders in West Iowa. And it grieves me. I've had sheriffs, the sheriff of a county come to me at one signing and say, I really wish you would research, investigate this murder and write about it. This story needs to be told. And I'm like, he's offering to show me all these incredibly gory crime pictures and stuff. And I can't do it. This one reporter said, so, are you going to be a one-book wonder? And I said, in reference to, give me an example of one-book wonder. And he said, Harper Lee and Margaret Mitchell. They wrote one book each. I'm going, oh, I only hope so. Write one book, be famous, not have to have, hello. But no, I don't plan to do it again. But my agent thinks I am. So I don't plan to do it again. If every time I start researching a case, and because this has happened twice, and it has happened each time, I would get a very odd case and start looking into it on my downtime from all this book tour. And word would get out that I'm researching that case. And the next thing you know, somebody who's been babying the research of this case for 10 years would just panic and would throw a book out that was not a very good book. And it happened twice. And both times, each one said, well, I wasn't finished, but I heard Carolyn Deloge was researching this. This is in Georgia. Carolyn Deloge was researching this case, and I didn't want her to beat me. And they blamed me for the poor quality of the book. So I just said, I'm not telling anybody anymore what I'm doing. All I'm going to tell you is I'm going for a long hike. Now, I'm not taking my laptop with me. Yes, sir.
Did any of your tribulations, any of the survivors, any of them, ever threaten you with lawsuits or anything like that?
There are none. There are none. The only person that I worried about was the judge, because he's not implicated in that professor's book about being corrupted. But I did the genealogy on the judge. The judge died a bachelor, and his 2 maiden sisters died. And so there was no issue from that family, and nobody else. I had this little... one day when I become elderly and somebody calls me a little old lady, I'm going to hurt them. But but this lady was tiny, and in one of my Georgia talks, and they heard that I was getting ready to come back up to Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, do my talks up here, and she was like, well, this is a little bit of dirty laundry. I wish you wouldn't be showing outside of Georgia. And I thought, well, here comes the first argument. And she said, but it happened, and it's true, and we need to just start owning up to all this and get on with our lives. So that's pretty much the attitude. Nobody has gotten hostile. First of all, nobody knew about this case. Even people who are descendants of some of these people, except for the Howards, they knew about it. Yes, ma'am.
I
I didn't understand what Tom's supposed motive was.
I didn't bring it out, and usually I wait for somebody to ask that. Why did they accuse him and execute him? They tried him because, well, the case against him was the death of the baby, which is ironic. They said, remember I told you that the family was his half family, his half brothers and sisters, and Maddie was his stepmother. Tom, 6 months before the murders, Tom met a woman, and he was going to ask her to marry him. And he goes to his father and he says he wants to know what his birthright is. He's the oldest son of a plantation owner, and he wanted to know what's mine. And the father tells him, I don't own the land. That's the first time it became known what the problems were with the land. And Tom finds out that his stepmother, who he had had a lot of good relationships with up to that point, his stepmother owns the land. And there was this huge fight. Well, basically, she said he wasn't going to get it, that the land was going to go to all of her children because she owned it. And there was this huge fight. He went and tried to get an attorney to help him get his birthright, and he realized everybody says no, can't get it because basically Maddie's got the land. And he leaves and he goes away to Texas for about 6 weeks and turns around and comes back and everything's fine. He marries the woman, but when she realizes he's not this big plantation owner, she leaves him a month later. And everything goes back to normal. But then this family is killed, and the baby is killed. And the position of Bibb County was either he was a coward and he ran, he deserves to die, which was most of the people. But the officials of Bibb County said, if you were robbing, you wouldn't kill the baby. The baby's helpless, the baby can't identify you. You wouldn't kill the baby. Only if you're trying to wipe out this family line. They want, basically they use the words genetics, but they said wipe out that genetic line, that DNA line. And that was the case against Tom, which was ironic because if Simon Cooper had carried out what he had hoped, leave the baby alive so that the baby could be a silent witness, then Tom would not have been as implicated as he was. Interesting. Any other question? Yes, sir. Oh, you mean you can participate in this?
Will now.
Okay.
2 questions.
Yes, sir.
1, how did you get the axe handle?
Axe head.
Axe head.
Right.
And 2, you said that a lot of information got scattered around the country. How did that come about?
Well,
any stories?
there was, I can pretty much explain both of those. The axe, when they burned the evidence, obviously it was the new jail. It was the new jail, and it was the burn pit of the new jail. And when they tore down the new jail, which now is the old jail, and they were selling the property, all of the the land was being excavated. And local archaeologists went, and when they found the burn pit, the archaeologists go after privies and burn pits. I mean, they just go crazy. They just start drooling when they say, we found the burn pit, or found the privy. Well, they found the burn pit, and they excavated it. And when I came along and was writing the book, and up to that point, the axe was of no consequence to me. I knew exactly what it looked like. I knew that it was a single beveled edge, hand-forged wood chopper's axe. And I also knew the dimensions because they were in the trial records. The newspapers especially talked about the dimensions. When I started, I wanted to have an example of the axe so that when I was writing it, I'd get a good feel for it. And so I went looking, and I couldn't find one that had the right dimensions. I could find single bevel edge hand forged, but not the right dimensions. They'd always be just a little off. And the blacksmith said, well, it's because it's hand forged. They're not going to be identical. He said, if you want them exact dimensions, and I'm that picky, I wanted exact dimensions, he said, then go find the original axe. And I went to the records, and I showed they burned the evidence. So I went, and there's this new condominium, and somebody had, and the jail's gone, and somebody said, but there was an archaeologist on the site, so I tracked him down. And he brought out the boxes, and this one says Macon Jail Burn Pit, and he brought out all this stuff. And he was so excited because of locks and keys and chains and parts of guns and knives and stuff, and he got all excited. And I had to sit there and watch all this stuff come out. And then he brings out this short-handled wood axe, the axe head. And I grabbed my tape measure and started measuring it And it was the exact dimensions. Well, I asked him, he's like an amateur archaeologist. He's retired, he's not working for anybody, it's his junk. And I asked him how much he wanted the axe for, and he said, well, give me $20. It's just going to sit in the box. And then I said, did you know about the Woolfolk killings? And he said, oh, you think that's the axe? And I went, yeah, now how much do you want? I was ready to sell my house, my brother's house, my mother's house, everything I owned to get this axe head. And he said, well, you tracked it down, you did the work, I've just been holding it for you all these years. And he let me have it for 20. Next question was, there's no short answer to my answers.
Were different
The records. Around 1930, there was a true crime article about this case out of New York. It was a terrible article, but it came out, and that was like the generation that was just beginning to forget this case. Well, the records start disappearing right after that out of Bibb County Courthouse. It was a sensational, I'm sure people just descended upon Bibb County and they got tired and they put the records somewhere else. What I was able to do was able to track down this clerk, this retired recorder, a clerk of court. And she said that she started noticing after Judge so-and-so retired that the records, people would ask for the records and they couldn't find them. So I did, you notice I don't say the man's name, I did a genealogical trace. I tracked down the man. His widow was actually, his daughter was actually in LA, out in California. And I got an attorney to deal with her, and because I wanted to go, she said, yeah, I have all the boxes of my grandfather's briefs and stuff. And I asked permission to get into them, and we had to come clean and tell her that we were looking for stolen documents, because she wouldn't let us see it. Why are you from Georgia wanting to see all this stuff, and I wasn't going to lie to her and then get sued later. So we came clean and said we were looking for stolen documents we thought that he took. And then I had to sign a promise, an affidavit promising that I would not ever divulge his name as having stolen the records, that I'd protect the integrity of his memory. And we found the 9 indictments in her possession. And we were able to get them back to the courthouse in Macon. So you can find them now. But the trial transcript I could never bring back. Fortunately, the transcript, there was a copy sent to the State House because they appealed it. And so that was protected, and I was able to track that down. I found documents in Texas and also in New York, just various. The execution order was in New York, and that list of jurors was in Texas. I know. It took me 27 years, and it's because I was on the trail. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what happened to Tom's full siblings?
His 2 older sisters, yes, they lived out their lives and raised their children, and the grandchildren are alive today. I've had a lot of great-grandchildren are alive today. A lot of the grandchildren are pretty much gone, and the great-grandchildren are actually dying off. But yes, it was interesting. The Woolfolk family at the time before the murders was a very dynamic, outgoing family. Had parties all the time. Yet after the killings and after the execution, the family, the generations now, are very introverted, and they will apologize for being in the same room with you and breathing the air. They are that insecure, and apparently they were ostracized as a family. Imagine having the name Woolfolk in Georgia after this. And as a matter of fact, you don't find people in Georgia with that name. They're gone. And there's one family. Any other questions? I had a hand.
You've been doing this for 27 years.
Mm-hmm. What did I do around it?
Yeah.
I'm a research analytical.
What was your motive to begin with? I mean, I'm
Well,
sure you didn't think this was going to be a 27-year
No. I'm an analytical research chemist. I used to work for top secret government research. And it was the chemist in me collecting the data. People would ask me, first of all, I never read that whole time a detective book, a murder mystery. I didn't have to. I was on my own. And people would ask me, and I'd say, they said, where have you been? I said, I was in it. I'm researching my own murder mystery, you know. Well, who did it? I don't know yet, you know. I'm on his trail. I tracked that Simon Cooper all over the South. He disappeared constantly on me. It took me forever. I was never planning to write a book, but I wanted to know why. I want to know 3 things. 1, why didn't I hear about this? Why was it buried? Maybe just 2 things. 2, this is bigger than Lizzie Borden ever thought of being. This should be in Legends. I mean, this is a big story. It was before Lizzie Borden. As a matter of fact, in Lizzie Borden articles, they would say, not unlike the murder at the Woolfolk in Georgia, reminiscent of the horrible Georgia murders. I mean, there was precedence. And I wanted to know, why was this thing forgotten? And then when I stumbled upon Jackson DuBose, I wanted to know, what are they thinking? What are they doing? This is insane. The man is turning up information and they're not even wanting to talk to him. So I'm going to go sit down. We've got food. And remember now, I'll autograph the books. Christmas is coming. Mother's Day is coming. Father's Day is coming. If you buy a book, it supports your local organization, your local library through the Friends. So please buy a book. And it's going to become a movie, so you'll have a book. And I'm going to go sit down.
Thank you.
Thank you.